Students sometimes speak with dialects or differences in language that are related to their culture. So what is your professional opinion on how these differences impact assessment approaches in oral language? The first thing that we need to remember is that it's a language difference, not a language deficit. So we take the things that make up language, like phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, and we realize that there's many variations of the English speaking language. There's the standard American English, or the mainstream. There's Ebonics. There's code switching, which is switching between two or more languages. So if someone speaks Spanish and English, when they can interpret and they can go back and forth between the languages and speak to different people using their language, that's called code switching. And then we look at variations of pronunciation, final sounds, verb usage, and literal translation. So some examples of those could be pronouncing words where a Hispanic person may say a W instead of an R. So we need to look at that and say, are they actually not able to say their R and need some speech help, or are they just trying to train? Is it just being pronounced incorrectly through translation? Sometimes students will leave off the final sounds. So car would be just ka. Verb usage, like sometimes they just leave out verbs, like he hatin', he be hatin', things like that. So we want to make sure that they are aware of what verbs are, how to use them, and when they should be appropriately placed. And then just literal translation. The example in the book was a phrase that is a Spanish phrase that to us would seem like it was very inappropriate and not very nice, but in their culture, that's just how it's a term of endearment for them. So there's lots of different literal translation situations like that. Phonology, morphology, and syntax are the three that are studied the most because it's just kind of how we speak, what we're saying, the English speaking or the English language rules, things like that. So when we are assessing these students, we want to assume that they have normal dialect. We want to assume that there are no speech issues that we should be working with. We want to assume that they know how to speak correctly. We do not want to over or undercompensate, meaning we don't want to look at their language and just assume automatically that it's a speech delay or that it's something that they need special education services for. So we need to do proper assessment procedures. A lot of the time that is informal because there's not the appropriate assessment tools available. There's not the appropriate qualified staff that's available to do the assessments. These can often, by using assessment procedures that are not appropriate, it can often lead to discrimination. It can lead to testing procedures that just are not accurate, where it may place a student in special education services that doesn't actually need special education services, or not place a student and then when they do need it. So oftentimes we can use comparative data, which you would use students of the similar background, similar culture, things like that, to compare their data to. So if a student that you're testing is saying a phrase, then also listen to how a typical student of that culture or language speaks, and then compare the two to get a more accurate assessment procedure reading. There are some intervention options available to students who are English learners if they need additional services. So there's typically a bilingual education service and ELL service mixture. So that can look like bilingual education with special education support, special education with bilingual education support, special education with a bilingual teacher, or with a bilingual aide. We can also do interviews and investigations, so find out about the family and their culture and other teachers that have worked with these students, if there are any other teachers, other schools, kind of find out about the student and how their background is, just like we would with our typical English speaking students. It's important to know where the student's coming from, what type of home the student's coming from, just things about the student that's going to help you determine services. A really big intervention is just prevention, early intervention, making sure that we're getting them the appropriate services, using the appropriate testing to intervene early enough that we can try to prevent special education services, because services are sometimes hard to get into, but once you get into them, they're even harder to get out of. So we don't want to place a student in special education services that doesn't actually need the services. We can also use interpreters in the classroom, in the special education classroom, and additional staff like speech therapy, also physical therapy and things like that. But as far as speaking, just staff that's going to be able to help our students understand what's being taught to them. So we don't necessarily want them to only speak English and they're only going to understand English. We want them to be able to be assessed, and we want them to be able to understand what they're learning in whatever language that they need first, and then we can work on the English. I feel like this is a really big question to hit on. So, why are students who are culturally and linguistically diverse sometimes over or under identified for special education services? A lot of the times they are under identified because of barriers. There's informal policies in place where we just assume that the student, if they can't speak English, then they must automatically qualify for special education services, and that's just not true. Also, there's just a lot of, if the student is not speaking Spanish, which is the most typical second language or first language along with English, if it's Japanese or Chinese or just other languages that we don't have as many students with, there's not a lot of qualified staff. So we need to be able to provide the appropriate, I think I've said this a few times, but just providing the appropriate assessment tools for these students. Sometimes things can get lost in translation, and not everything translates straight over from English to another language, even Spanish. So making sure that what you're asking them and what they're answering are the same thing. So you can't ask a question and assume that they're going to know exactly what you're looking for, which makes it really difficult because the training it's hard. It's student by student basis. And the training is just not there for the staff that we need to be able to appropriately assess these students. And along with that, there's a lot of assumptions. There's assumptions that if a child comes from a culturally different background, that they're not going to be able to speak English, or they don't want to learn how to speak English, or they're not able to keep up in the general education classroom, so they have to automatically go to special education services, and that's not true either. And then there's just certain characteristics that are assumed, and we want to treat each individual student as an individual. We don't want to assume that because of their culture or because of the way they speak or how you hear it or the way things translate that they need services or don't need services. They can also be over-identified, again with assumptions, the inappropriate tools, and we expect them to automatically know what to say. And like any student, they need to be taught. We need to teach them how to speak English after we get their language, like smooth. We want them to be able to speak and then be able to learn English and be able to study all that in school, because we want to really help our student first and not try to mold them into something that we can assess through our own testing, like our standardized tests. Because those just don't really work that way, and we want our students to be successful. And again, just having the staff to accommodate the needs of our students, whether that's language or physical therapy or occupational therapy. These students deserve to be treated with an equal opportunity, and they deserve to have the appropriate education. So it's very important that we just make sure that we are doing everything that we can to help all of our students be accurately assessed, and whether that means that we need special education services to be kind of molded a little bit for them, because in the end, it's the individual student that we are trying to create success for.